Horror, a genre in movie that brings out one of the most important primal emotions, fear. The sole reason why us as a species keep on improving our living situation, in the fear that if we don't, we will be demoted to the level of other species in the world, who keep on living in the fear of getting their life snatched out of them at any moment. That is why there is a certain incentive towards innovating new things, from making vaccines to survive from deadly viruses, to sending rovers to different planets for the potential of finding a new habitual place for our species to live on. It all boils down to one thing: survival. And horror movies evoke that feeling of vulnerability inside us. People get that feeling of adrenaline rushing in their veins, that goosebump, chill-inducing high of excitement that people tend to get keeps them coming back to it. It's like eating hot and spicy food. You know that it'll hurt a little bit, but it's gonna be a fun ride of emotions. Yes, there are variety of other cuisines, but they don't treat you the same. Well, the same goes for movies. There are other genres, but horror movies are just built different. With all that being said, personally, I don't watch it for the thrill of emotions. I just like it because it's good. Okay, there's more to that. Let's go back to a time when I was pretty young. From an early age, I was fascinated by anything horror related, even though it would scare the shit out of me, but still, for some reason, I would just keep on watching those type of horror movies or series. Don't worry, there is a reason as to why I'm talking about my childhood obsession with horror. Because at that time, I would watch anything horror related, get scared shitless, and wouldn't think twice if it was a good movie or not. At that age, my half-assed brain wasn't developed enough to think about those questions. I was too busy wondering if Hogwarts was real or not, or where I can get that watch from Ben 10. It didn't matter if it was some cheap jump scare or a scene that was dumbed down for the sole purpose of making the viewer scared. The point that I'm trying to make is, at that moment, anything horror related was considered good by me. But now that I'm an adult who has watched shitload of movies, or someone who has just too much free time, watching horror movies nowadays doesn't feel the way it used to. Even watching the old ones that I used to like when I was young are just not as effective as they used to be. And the reason behind it is not that I'm older so I don't find things scary anymore. Because I do. I'm still afraid of the dark. There are a couple of good ones here and there which get released every other year, and some old hidden gems that were overlooked. But that's it. There are hardly movie titles to look forward to. They look promising when they get announced, but turn out to be a bigger disappointment than I am to my parents. Horror as a genre has came a long way. The first known horror film was The Haunted Castle or The House of the Devil. It's a 3-minute short film which was released in 1896. There were numerous other influences, but this was the one that might have started it all. People from different places and countries started to give their own twist to this new genre of that time. In the 1910s, horror movies based on folklore stories was in its rise, which was continued in the next decade, and they added gothic themes in the mix too. It was between 1920s and 30s when horror movies reached mainstream popularity, with movies like Nosferatu and Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, which were released in the 1920s. And in the 1930s, there was Dracula and Frankenstein. Amidst all that, there were some notable ones which tried to do something different, the likes of The Invisible Man and King Kong, which broke the boundaries of creativity in the direction of movie making. This was the golden years of horror movies, which gave birth to so many iconic monsters that are still getting used to this day. Seeing the popularity of using monsters in this genre, dozens of half-assed movies came out in the 1940s. The only notable ones that tried to do something else and succeeded were Cat People and the Wolfman. On came the 50s, a time filled with the fear of a world at war and a nuclear threat that can wipe everyone in mere seconds. And that fear wasn't helped by the horror movies that were released in those times. From Godzilla to Creature from the Black Lagoon, portraying unimaginable monsters at a time when it looked like it all can happen. Those weren't the only ones though. The Fly and the invasion of the body snatchers kept that fear of hysteria alive in people. But at the same time, there was a turn of the tides in what is considered horror in those movies. House of Wax, a different sort of horror movie, unlike all the monster-based stories that were made previously. It focused more on the real horror, us, human beings. 1960s, considered the golden age of Hollywood, and it was the year which saw the release of one of the best horror movies of all time, Psycho by Alfred Hitchcock, which was released in 1960 but still stands the test of time. Personally, I'm not a huge fan of monster-based horror movies. Yes, they were the cornerstone of this whole genre, but they don't get me like the ones which, has a chance of happening in real life. Psycho was amongst the many movies that gave people real, legitimate fear about things that can actually happen. Rosemary's Baby, Repulsion, Peeping Tom, Whatever Happened to Baby Jane are some of the classic horror movies that came out around the same time. It made people realize that the most horrifying things can be done by none other than us, humans. In the latter stage of the decade, Night of the Living Dead got released, which was continued with 2 more movies by the same director in the following 2 decades. Horror movies based on real-life situations or scenarios were continued in the 1970s, which saw the rise of 2 subgenres in horror, slashers and serial killers, with movies like Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Halloween, Black Christmas and Deep Red. Not only that, but there were some movies with really unique ideas which gave them a sense of nightmarish feel to it. The likes of Carrie, Don't Look Now, The Omen, Eraserhead, The Tenant, Suspiria, and The Wicker Man. This decade was full of new and fresh ideas, and with titles like Jaws and Alien, it made the whole genre even more popular to the general public. On the flip side, 1980s horror movies were a mixed bag. A Nightmare on the Elm Street core concept was so unique, and it was released at a time where most of the slasher movies were just making lame sequels. Another movie that was equally funny and horrifying was Evil Dead, which then started a movement of showing lots of gory scenes in horror movies. And that gave the rise of David Cronenberg and his iconic subgenre of body horror. Even though this decade saw the release of iconic titles like The Shining and The Thing, there weren't that many great horror movies that came out at that time. It did had some hidden gems like The Possession, The Changeling, and Santa Sangre, but other than that, the 80s were just full of cheesy teen slasher movies. Unfortunately, this lack of creativity was continued in the next decade. Until Scream came out, which brought the serial killer, mass murderer right at your doorstep. Along with the new wave of slasher movies, the 1990s also saw the rise of psychological horror movies. Silence of the Lambs, Jacob's Ladder, and Misery, to name some of them. Lots of Japanese horror got mainstream popularity by adding their own twist to this whole genre. Ringu, Audition, and Cure were some of the best of their time. The decade and the century ended with a bang. In 1999, Blair Witch Project came out, showcasing a totally unique subgenre in horror movies. With the rise of found footage horror and more explicit scenes in horror movies, the new millennium gave us movies like Hostel and Saw, which had scenes that contained extreme violence and gore that wasn't seen in a big screen before. But that wasn't the only influential subgenre that defined the decade, as there was a plethora of found footage horror movies, Paranormal Activity being the most popular one, while the likes of Wreck and Cloverfield being the rare movies that successfully implemented the concept without overdoing it. With the new century came lots of technological advancements which opened a whole new door of ideas. There were so many of them with really unique ideas: Pulse, Lake Mungo, American Psycho, and Final Destination. Some took old tropes that were done in the previous decades and used that as an influence to make something entirely different. Few of the notable titles among them can be Tale of Two Sisters, The Others, Orphanage, Frailty, and Descent. Basically, what I'm trying to say is that it was a decade full of new ideas and concepts on how to do horror movies. And the decade after that followed it with even more great ideas. Psychological horror became the main force of this time. Rather than unsettling the audience with disturbing imagery, they used that concept to play with the mind of the viewer. Mother, Goodnight Mommy, Swallow, and It Comes at Night can be some of the better examples of that. Yes, there were lots of straight to the point, spooky, scary, full of jump scare horror movies too. The Conjuring and Insidious being the most popular franchises. Some that flew under the radar that deserve way more recognition are movies like The Wailing and Demon. Fortunately, there were movies like A Quiet Place, Don't Breathe, Mandy, Raw, The Endless, The Invitation, It Follows, and Autopsy of Jane Doe to keep the genre fresh, as it was becoming oversaturated with so many lookalikes, feel the same, can't differentiate type of movies. I have been talking about the past of horror for a good amount of time, but there is a reason to it. To really understand what horror is, you have to know the past of it. Horror as a genre has came a long way. It went through lots of phases and changes over time. It is a genre that people love to experiment with. I talked about most of them, or the ones that I appreciate to a certain point. But when you think of the current decade of horror movies, by that I mean latter parts of 2010s mixed with the 2020s, there aren't that many directors with good horror movies that I can recall of. And this is what I meant when I said that there are hardly anything good to look forward to in this genre. Of course, there are some exceptions. Ari Aster with Hereditary and Midsommar, continuing the trend of making unsettling horror with a mix of other subgenres. And Robert Eggers with The Witch and The Watchtower. Just like the previous two movies, these two dabbled their feet into other subgenres while keeping the unsettling part intact. But by far, one of the biggest names in modern horror can be of Jordan Peele. With movies like Get Out and Us, he brought a cultural difference into the whole genre, keeping the core meaning of horror alive, but at the same time bringing in ideas that no one dared to implement in horror movies. He can easily be the face of this decade's horror. With one good glance at the thumbnail, you can easily come to the conclusion that this video was going to be based on Jordan Peele. But that's not the case. This video is not about him or his movies. Yes, that means you have been clickbaited. But wait, there is a reason to it. If you think about who has defined the horror genre as a whole in recent times, Jordan Peele comes to mind. Yes, There were some great movies that came before Get Out and Us. If you are a horror fanatic, you might have noticed that there were some obvious movies that I didn't name. Almost everyone who loves this genre has seen some movie by this director, and most of the time his name doesn't even come up while talking about this generation's horror movies that stand out from the rest. Mike Flanagan. Another reason to use Jordan Peele in the thumbnail was that they rock the same shaved haircut. So, the problem with previous directors is that their catalog of movies isn't that long. Their movies are great and can be considered among the best in recent times. But none of those directors can do what Mike Flanagan does so efficiently. He has been making horror movies for almost a decade now. But it wasn't always like this. Mike Flanagan was born in Salem, Massachusetts. That explains why he got interested in horror movies. But in his early years, as a student film, he wrote, edited and directed a movie by the name of Make Believe, a coming-of-age drama revolving around the life of 4 college friends who are working on a production of Romeo and Juliet. It has a decent rating of 5.5 out of 10 on IMDb. And after an year, he again wrote, edited, directed and produced the movie Still Life, another drama movie that consists of 4 college students. The rating of this isn't vastly different than the previous one. And in 2003, after just 3 years of making films, his movie won numerous awards. Ghosts of Hamilton Street, a movie about a troubled writer who starts to question his sanity after his loved ones start to disappear. Even in this early stage of his directing career, you can see that there was a real emphasis on character development in his writing. Well, the rating didn't improve that much, but the reviews looked very promising. And after 3 years of gap, he finally released his first horror-based movie, Oculus, Chapter 3, The Man with the Plan, a 30-minute short film, which did better than his previous movies, getting a respectable 6.3 rating on IMDb. The concept of this movie was way ahead of its time, focusing more on characters at a time when most of the movies were busy outdoing each other by showing more gruesome scenes. The whole movie revolves around Scott Graham as he tries to prove that the mirror is evil, which influenced his father to commit horrible atrocities. It was an instant cult classic, which garnered a loyal fan base who made his next movie possible. After 5 long years of nothing, he made his first feature-length film that was crowdfunded through Kickstarter, as he rejected to make his film in a found footage format. Absentia is a supernatural horror movie that follows the life of 2 sisters, Trisha, whose husband Daniel went missing 7 years ago and haunts her, or it's just her hallucinating him caused from all that stress and guilt that came after he disappeared. Then, out of nowhere, he just comes back after he was presumed dead. All he can recall is going through the tunnel near their house. The younger sister, Callie, gets interested in finding more about this mysterious tunnel. After some research, she finds out that there were more disappearances related to that place. The movie is slow-paced and character-driven, which focuses mainly on how the characters react to something that they can't fully understand. They used secluded neighborhood and dark-lit surroundings to give this movie atmospheric, eerie vibes. But apparently, that didn't sit well with the audience, even though it caught the eyes of way more people with thousands of reviews left on IMDb. Unlike the general audience, the critics seem to enjoy it a lot. And personally, I think this was one of his better works in his early career. It could have been more polished, but the idea behind the movie was pretty solid. In 2013, Mike returns with a fully fleshed out version of his short film, Oculus, which starred some big names like Karen Gillan, Brenton Thwaites, and Kate Sackhoff. The storyline of this movie can be split into 2 parts. First being the flashbacks to the time when they were young, while the second one is when they meet again as adults and try to make sense of what actually happened. This movie uses aspects from two types of horror: supernatural, being the mirror actually interfering with the reality, and psychological, as it shows how an unhealthy relationship impacts not only the parents but their children too. The younger sibling had the worst outcome from all of that. After both of his parents were killed, he was sent to a mental institution to recover from the trauma that he endured from that night. After he gets discharged, her older sister brings him back to the house to destroy the mirror for once and all and prove that his brother was innocent. Just like Absentia, Mike keeps the whole movie confined into a small place, in this scenario being their childhood house. And as usual, it's a slow-paced psychological horror where the characters are the driving force. This movie made Mike Flanagan get noticed by the mainstream media, which was received pretty well by the critics. But again, the audience weren't a huge fan of this one. All the downsides that they were stating didn't seem like a big problem to me. And this movie was way better than the next one that I'm going to talk about. In 2016, Mike Flanagan released 3 horror movies. The first one that I wanted to mention is Before I Wake. It starts out as Jesse and Mark adopt Cody after losing their own son, who looks like a pretty normal child. But as you know, that isn't the case. Cody has difficulties to fall asleep. I can relate, Cody. I can relate. But it's not because he's afraid of the dark or something typical that kids are scared of. Of course, not me. The reason being his dreams tend to manifest in reality, which starts out to be a wonderful thing. But eventually, we see why he said that he was afraid of sleeping. Because his nightmares become real too. The movie was perceived as pretty decent in the eyes of critics. But as usual, the general audience didn't like it that much. This time, I kind of understand them. The base premise of this film, from a general point of view, sounds like a horror movie. And it is. Just like his previous movies, it involves supernatural phenomena. But the whole movie feels like a fantasy with horror elements rather than a fully fledged horror film. Personally, I don't mind that. And I really appreciate that he used childhood trauma and how a person deals with that as a reasoning. But to me, this feels like his weakest entry in his catalog of horror movies. I really liked the interesting twist that he brought to an old character trope. Other than that, I cannot recall anything else that was remarkable about this movie. The next movie that was released around the same time was Ouija, Origin of Evil. It was the prequel to Ouija, which was released in 2014. And that movie was pretty bad, to say the least. And it wasn't made by Mike Flanagan, so we will just ignore that one. Well, this movie takes place in 1967, where a widowed mother, Alice, along with her 2 daughters, do a job of being the spiritual medium between people and their loved ones who have passed away. Everything was going fine until the young daughter just asks her mother to use Ouija boards in her seance. Because why the hell not? And most of you guys know what happens next. They get in contact with a real ghost whom they think is the spirit of their deceased father, which isn't the case, and they get involved with something truly terrifying that they shouldn't have messed with. This movie uses lots of typical horror cliches: scary little girl, haunted looking house with a basement, priest who comes by to help but gets fucked up. But the way he uses them is what makes this movie stand out from all the other lookalikes of that time. We are not afraid of something that we can see, but we fear things that we can't see or something that is hidden. Where other horror movies just straight up fill the screen with something creepy looking with the volume set to fuck the eardrums, while this movie uses minimalism approach towards its jump scare moments. which doesn't sound like a huge difference on paper, but on screen, it's way more effective. This was, in my opinion, way better than the previous film that I talked about, as Mike Flanagan again takes a pre-established trope and blends it with some fresh ideas to not only stand out from its predecessor, but the whole possession-based horror movies in general. The last movie in this 2016 trio of horror was Us, which starred Kate Siegel in the lead role, wife of Mike Flanagan and the co-writer of this movie. The plot of this film focuses on Maddie, a deaf writer, who decided to live alone in the middle of nowhere. There have been numerous movies before this who have disabled characters in the lead role, but this one stands out from the rest for how well it captures the emotion of paranoia. It is a mix between two subgenres, slasher and home invasion, but rather than having lots of characters, it is trimmed down to just two of them. The unnamed killer follows Maddie's friend, Sarah, and after killing her in front of Maddie's porch, he decides to make her his next target. It starts out pretty slow as he takes or alters her belongings to make her suspicious of her surroundings. But after she figures out that someone is in her house, it turns into a cat and mouse game. This movie takes inspiration from various other subgenres of horror, but what makes it special is that how well it implements all those elements together. It avoids all the cliches and dumb decisions made by some unfinished characters by adding a well-written character who makes really clever choices to keep herself away from harm's way. It might not be considered horror by some people, but the way it uses paranoia of someone being in your house and how easily it can happen to anyone in real life makes it one of the most realist and scariest horror movies in recent times. This was Mike's first movie that was appreciated by critics and fans alike, and easily ranks above all the previous films that he made in the past, not only in terms of an original idea, but how well it's shot, directed, and edited. 1 year after that, in 2017, he released a movie adaptation of Gerald's Game by Stephen King, starring Carla Gugino and Bruce Greenwood as an old couple, and they are trying to spice up their marriage by taking a vacation to a remote lake house. Handcuffs get involved, pills get popped, husband fucking dies. And this is where the movie starts with its mindfuckery. Jessie is now left handcuffed to the bed with her husband lying dead beneath her. In his previous movie, Us, the majority of the scenes took place in or around the house, and in this one, we are just left with a single room where Jessie is left with her thoughts and maybe something sinister who is out there to get her, as she tries her best to get out from that dire situation for the sake of her own survival. Even though she is able to move her body, the whole scenario seems extremely claustrophobic, which is used perfectly to create a suspenseful atmosphere of mind games and what is actually happening, which then triggers her to relive some of the moments from her traumatic childhood. Movie adaptation of novels by Stephen King hardly do well. Either the fans of the writer get upset or the writer himself, but this was one of those rare movies adapted from his novel that did good in almost every term. An extremely well done psychological horror with his trademark use of traumatic past, and how that, mixed with the fatigue that comes with the situation, can affect an individual not only physically but mentally too, as this movie made us realize that our own mind can be the worst enemy of ourselves. After releasing two back-to-back great horror movies in 2018, with the fame and reputation that he gained from those movies, landed him on the deal of making the sequel to The Shining, Dr. Sleep. An adaptation of a Stephen King novel by the same name came out in 2019 and served as a direct sequel to Kubrick's Shining. This was quite different than Mike Flanagan's usual movies. The runtime was a bit longer. Personally, I didn't mind the movie being a bit long, as Mike Flanagan wanted it to be like that. I'll get into the specifics of that later. The plot takes place years after the horrific acts that happened in the Overlook Hotel. Danny Torrance is now an adult who works in a nursing home looking after people who are on the verge of dying. Through his gift of signing, he gets a message from a young girl who shares the similar power like him about a group by the name of True North, who hunt people that have the ability to sign. As it is getting more and more scarce, the group starts to become even more desperate, killing anyone who can provide them the steam which can extend their lifespans. Abra Stone, the young girl, has even greater signing powers than Dan, which attracts the leader of True North, Rose, to get hold of Abra's location. The film has lots of supernatural and fantasy elements to it, something that Mike has done before in his movies, and that past experience helped him a lot while making this movie, as again he gains critical acclaim and the appreciation of the fans. He gained the trust of everyone by paying homage to its predecessor and at the same time staying true to the novel, which made Stephen King admire him a lot. He was true to his style too, not using the whole concept to pull in some over-the-top jump scares, but rather than that, he focused more on the mental toll that comes from the PTSD that was a result of Danny's childhood, from losing his whole family in just a night, which to him felt like a nightmarish dream, to how he resorted to alcohol to not only repress his powers, but those memories too. Around this time, between 2017 and 2019, Mike Flanagan released a series by the name of The Haunting of Hill House, which single-handedly restored my faith in horror as a genre in modern times. Usually, I don't like television series, as they tend to overstretch than what they have to offer. If you can recall, earlier I said that I didn't mind the length of Dr. Sleep, because after watching this series, I understood that if he makes the runtime a bit long, then it's only because the story demands it. If you are a real horror connoisseur, then you would have noticed that I didn't mention a horror movie while talking about 1960s horror, The Haunting, which was released in 1963, that was based on the novel The Haunting of Hill House by Shirley Jackson. This movie is entirely different than the series, but still has its own merits. Well, the series is loosely based on the novel, which was used as a building block rather than a full-on adaptation. It consists of 10 episodes, the first 5 being introductions to all the kids of Hugh and Olivia Crane. The first episode focuses on the oldest son, Stephen Crane, who has moved past all the unexplained things that happened in their childhood house, and now is a successful writer after his autobiographical story about his experiences that happened with him and his family in the Hill House became a bestseller, in which he states that he does not believe in the paranormal but thinks all of the unexplained occurrences stem from some mental illness. The oldest daughter, Shirley Crane, decided to become a mortician after being fascinated by the one who fixed her mother and returned her previous beauty in her funeral. One night, she gets a call that their youngest sister had died in the Hill House, so she decides to go there to arrange her funeral. Theo Crane, the younger sister of Shirley, from an early age was able to perceive the feelings of people and objects when she touched them with her bare hands, and for that reason, she works as a counselor, giving guidance to people about their problems. After hearing the unfortunate news of her younger sister dying, she goes there and gets a flashback of her mother who was getting pushed inside the house when they were fleeing the Hill House. The youngest son, Luke Crane, got addicted to drugs after using it to cope with what happened with them in that house. But things were starting to go in the right direction for him. He was 90 days clean and was doing good in rehab program until he hears the news about his youngest sister dying, which was especially harder for him as they were twins, and he claimed that she didn't commit suicide. Nell Crane, the youngest and twin sister of Luke, they always had a special connection as they can feel each other's physical ailments. She married the doctor who was assigned to her for her problems with sleep paralysis, but tragically, he dies after suffering a brain aneurysm, which takes a huge toll on her mental state as she goes back to the Hill House, where the house tricks her into thinking that she was putting on her mom's locket, but in reality, it was a noose. The overall story of this series is divided into two timelines. One being when they were young kids and dealt with all the unexplainable phenomenons, and the other being them all grown up and how they are coping with all those problems caused by their past. The characters are extremely well written, acted, and the direction is just a cherry on the top. The seamless flow between all the flashbacks and how they correspond with the present characters is done perfectly. The things that haunt every individual aren't just there for the sake of it. They each have their own meaning, and why it took the form of what it has all stems to how the house affected them. In the end of the day, it's a story about a family who suffered a tragic loss which made them fall apart, and years later, another loss brought them all together, which forced them to confront their inner demons that the Hill House brought upon them. It's Mike Flanagan at his best, as he takes all the best things from his past works and provides us with this masterpiece. There was so much effort put into this, even in the minuscule of things to create the perfect ambience. Well, this series, unsurprisingly, received appreciation by everyone who watched it. Even though it's a supernatural based horror, the actual mental issues that were portrayed sound more than plausible. On the surface, it might look like a haunted house type of horror, but it is so much more than that. But in its core, it is a horror drama about a broken family where one tragedy makes them fall apart while the other brings them together. That brings us to his last project that has released, The Haunting of Bly Manor, which is not a continuation of his previous series, nor is it related to it in any way, even though some of the cast members from the previous series play a character in this too. There was another movie in the 1960s that I left out, The Innocents, which came out in 1961, which was an adaptation of The Turn of the Screw by Henry James, while The Haunting of the Hill House was quite different from The Haunting. This one, on the other hand, is pretty similar in terms of the base premise. Both of them have their standout features, and the movie adaptation can still rival any horror film that has came out in recent time. The series uses other works of Henry James too, like The Jolly Corner and The Romance of Certain Old Clothes. Just like The Haunting of Hill House, this one too uses non-linear narrative to unfold its story. While the previous one was moving between two different timelines, this one follows 4. The first being when a woman tells a story about an au pair by the name of Danny Clayton, who gets hired by Henry Wingrave to look after his niece and nephew in the manor of Bly. She arrives there along with the cook and meets the children, Miles and Flora. The third timeline follows the previous caretaker, Rebecca Jessel, who allegedly killed herself, and her lover, Peter Quint, who is still missing after Rebecca died, which he doesn't know of and might be the reason why he is seen stalking the grounds of the manor. And the last one, which is about the owner of Bly Manor, 2 orphaned sisters, Viola and Perdita. The older sister, Viola, marries her distant cousin, Arthur Floyd. Together, they have a daughter, but then Viola falls ill with a lungs disease. After Perdita can no longer tolerate her bitter condition, she kills her and marries Arthur. There's a lot to it, but all these timelines are beautifully aligned in a manner that works wonders. In the previous series, Mike showed us that it might look like a horror on the outside, but beneath all that, it's a story about a family and how they deal with the loss of a loved one. And in this one, he continues that. It might look like a story about ghosts in a haunted looking place, which it is, but there are so many layers in this wonderfully crafted horror series. How a broken marriage in 2 entirely different timelines can affect the people in the future. It tackles lots of hard-hitting questions, like the existence of a loved one after they die, and how the tragedy of that loss can influence the people around it. In the end of the day, it's a love story, and how it alters the decision of someone for the good or the worst. I'm not a huge fan of romantic movies, but I liked this one because it doesn't force that whole love thing on you. That might be the reason why it didn't land with the fans of this whole series. I mean, they are to fault. Mike Flanagan at any time didn't say that this was related to his previous series in any way. I guess people just can't stop wanting more of something that is considered finished. But that doesn't stain the series to me in any way. It can be something of its own without being overshadowed by its predecessor. This is another classic Mike Flanagan style of horror, as he blends in lots of old tropes with some modernized ones that works better in the current climate, while touching in topics that we usually see in coming-of-age dramas, and delivers us with a well-fashioned horror drama which tells a tale about gothic love stories. The Haunting of Bly Manor might not boast lots of spooky, scary scenes, but what it does have is a heartfelt story about love and death that will leave a huge impact.
And it's perfectly splendid.
Currently, Mike Flanagan is working on his 2 upcoming television series, The Midnight Club and The Midnight Mass. I hope the dumb fans don't think these 2 are correlated too. The former is an adaptation of Christopher Pike's novel by the same name, which came out in 1994. It follows a group of 5 terminally ill patients who are living together in Rotherham Home Hospice. And every midnight, they meet and tell each other some scary stories. They make a pact that whoever dies first will contact the others from beyond the grave. But after one of them dies, some bizarre occurrences starts to happen with them. The latter one is an original story co-written by Mike Flanagan, which is centered around an isolated island community, and after the arrival of a mysterious priest, the people living there witness something bizarre, from miraculous events to frightening omens. With all of that, it concludes almost everything that Mike Flanagan has done in terms of directing movies. So, now that we have covered all of that, it begs the question, what makes him the master of modern horror? For a good chunk of this video, I talked about the past of horror, and there is a reason behind it. Horror genre as a whole has evolved a lot since it started way back in the 1900s. From Mario Bava's macabre of horror to Dario Argento's giallos, almost every decade had its own distinct subgenre dedicated to its time. And if you're wondering why I didn't talk that much about comedy horror in this video, because it deserves a video of its own. Maybe I'll dive into that later sometimes. For the time being, let's focus on the topic of this video. It has came to a point where there is hardly space left to innovate this genre in a totally different way. We have seen some minor changes in recent times, influenced by what is happening around the world. But other than that, horror of this current generation focuses more on abstract ideas. And that is where Mike Flanagan stands out from the rest of this era. He has done various type of horror movies, which involves different subgenres. But there are certain aspects that he always uses while making his movies. In terms of the base premise, he doesn't bring something that is entirely new. He is known for taking pre-established notions and adding his signature touch to them. Usually, he excludes all the stereotypical characteristics and cliches that are so overdone in this genre, like the silly camera work they tend to do just so they can add an annoying jump scare. There is no terror in the bang, only in the anticipation of it. And Mike uses this technique rather than piling on over-the-top jump scares in his movies. He tends to use slow pacing to build up the tension by keeping things to bare minimum at the start and upping the ante only when the story demands it. There is a lack of shock value scenes, something that turns down a lot of people from watching horror movies. He rarely relies on gore or explicit imagery until it goes along with the plot. If you look at all the movies that Mike has directed, most of them are in different subgenres, from supernatural ghosts to gothic themed love stories. But it doesn't matter what the setting of the movie is, there is always a hint of psychological horror in them, which makes his movie stay grounded to reality, at least in that aspect. He deals with lots of topics that most of us suffer from in the daily basis, and that somewhat makes his movie seem real, as it is the reality for so many people around the world. And all of that works because in his movies he focuses more on the characters and their development. Usually they have a troubled past, and some of the issues which originated from that still lingers around them in the present, and the plot revolves around them overcoming that obstacle. The characters are extremely well written, which allows their development to be the focal point of the movie, without being annoying as they take sensible and logical decisions which aren't dumbed down, just so they can kill off a random character for the sake of story progression. It makes the viewer feel respected, as they are not seen as some dumb humanoid. There are still some minor quirks in his earlier works, but the way he uses all of that is what makes his movies different. There was a movie that came out in 2014 that I didn't mention earlier, which can be the pioneer of the modern psychological horror that Mike usually does. Babadook, a movie that can be considered a conventional horror, and at the same time, It resembles the new wave of psychological horror as it deals with the huge toll that comes with mental illness and social problems. Even though Babadook holds a special place in my heart, I still think Mike Flanagan's vast movie catalog outshines it. His attention to small details which aren't going to be noticed by everyone is extremely respectable, like him partnering with the Newton brothers to make soundtracks for his movies and series. It's a sign of someone who really cares about his work. Another being casting people who have worked in his previous projects, as he sees that as a partnership where he can share his work with people that he really cares about. When people talk about the future of horror genre, Jordan Peele is the name that comes up in an instant. You have to be pretty dumb to neglect the change that he brought to this whole genre. It's pretty tough for any other director to overcome his enormous shadow of influence that he brought on with his movies. But Mike Flanagan might be the only one who comes close to him if he keeps on producing great movies. And I think he can, because unlike Jordan Peele, he has been honing his skill in making horror movies for a long time. He is not a one-time wonder and has consistently provided us with good movies. It might not be as groundbreaking as Get Out or Us, but what he does so naturally is creating an atmospheric horror that immerses you in the lives of characters who feel more than real. And isn't that the most important element of a great horror film? Sucking us in its world to make us believe that it's all real. Implant.